a sense of history about progressive education has different geographical places where it began to sort of germinate in American history. But interestingly, in Chicago, there's the University of Chicago Laboratory School, and the Francis Parker School, and the Latin School of Chicago, and Dick Hall's here, former head of the North Shore Country Day School, which was also founded by people who came out of the progressive education movement that was in Chicago. Progressive education was tied in many ways to some of the early work that Jane Addams and others were doing in Chicago to be very socially conscious citizens trying to tend to people of a wide variety of ethnic backgrounds, economic backgrounds. Education in America, as many of you know, was founded initially based on essentially what the Greeks had put in place thousands of years ago, that education in schools was for people who had the leisure to do so. And in time, there were crafts and more vocational-oriented education. But what began to happen, at least in the city of Chicago, was that there were people who were thinking about how was this new society, this new democracy going to last and thrive, and that the educational process needed to be different from that which was a part of more aristocratic societies. And so the whole idea of organizing a school where freedom was a high value, freedom to create curriculum, freedom to be nimble, freedom to make changes, freedom to allow kids to speak and to do things and to have their desk not screwed into the floor, but you could actually pick them up, move them, have some versatility. That was prized very highly because the aim of what these educators had in mind was who were these young people going to become when they grew up? They were going to be citizens in this democracy and in a diverse society. And they had to have experiences of making decisions, of being what Ralph Waldo Emerson called self-reliant. And they had to think for themselves. And so I'm going to wander to Labor Day and the controversy about President Obama actually speaking to school children and what the controversy was and why there were some people who thought this was a political act. Well, they were right for the wrong reasons. To talk about education is itself a political act. To be silent about education is itself a political act. Education is about empowerment, and it is about helping students learn basic skills, how to describe, how to analyze, how to synthesize, how to work together in groups, how to think for themselves. This is what the founders of progressive, or what we now call progressive education, were really trying to foster and generate in schools. Francis W. Parker himself grew up in New England and became a soldier in the Civil War. And he took a bullet in the neck fighting for democracy and freedom. And he was not the prolific writer that John Dewey was. He was a speaker, a lecturer, and a trainer of teachers. And his belief that what was so essential about progressive education was to be sure we were tuned in to the developmental needs of each individual child. So there was a developmental orientation, and that's a key aspect of what progressive education is. But to be child-centered is not enough. He also believed that, as did Dewey, that learning was essentially social, that education needed to take place in the context of community life, and that the idea of becoming an aspiring citizen who's aware of the needs of others was really crucial. On the outside wall of our school, brick wall by the front door, we have a statement that he made that we think helps guide us in our own practice. And he said that the needs of society should determine the work of the school. And he said the supreme need of society is ideal citizenship. An ideal citizenship demands for the individual the highest degree of knowledge, power, skill, and service. These were some bold statements. He was talking about that the supreme need, not just one of the more important needs, and he didn't talk about an average approach to citizenship. It was the ideal approach to citizenship, and that it demanded not a kind of so-so average level of knowledge and skill and service to others, but the highest degree. So embedded in progressive education is a high commitment to high standards, to a pursuit of excellence, and we interpret that sense of what excellence is about quality. And this is one of the things that Francis Parker, who John Dewey called the father of progressive education, and in some ways that was a compliment, and in some ways I think for Dewey, at least in the history of this tradition, was a way that he himself distanced himself from what progressive education was becoming at a certain time in the 30s and the 40s, where the focus was much more child-centered, and they lost perspective on it. It's a dual approach. To be only child-centered and not concerned about the needs of society is insufficient and irresponsible. And to be only focused on the aims of society without being tuned into the developmental needs of children, that too was considered.
Most of you know who Ted Sizer is. He founded the coalition, but then one day he announced at a meeting that he was going to devolve it, which meant he was going to retire, and it didn't have any organization when he left, and it kind of devolved. And the truth of the matter is, a lot of schools today have adopted his principles, but not too many of them call themselves coalition schools.
He wrote 3 books that are very well known. Horace's School, they all have the name Horace in them. Horace's Compromise, Horace's School, and Horace's Hope. And he wrote them all between maybe 1983 and 1990, something like that. And they just, they really set the nation on fire. They went back to some of the ideas that Dan's been talking about. He painted a picture of schools as places where kids were too passive, that not enough was being demanded of kids. They were studying chemistry but not doing chemistry, for example. And out of that evolved 9 and then later 10 common principles that schools all over the country began to.
One piece of the history, we've talked about Ted Sizer and about efforts to write. We got a writer over here. One of the things that I have found as I've looked through the history of progressive education, that for progressive educators, that teachers themselves have taken, because John Dewey as a philosopher tried to promote and articulate a lot about reflection. I think even on your own website there's a quote about Dewey, that you learn not from experience but by reflecting on experience. I may have butchered a little bit, but I think that's what I recall seeing. And so it's the reflection about the teaching and the learning and the professional practice of being an educator that has a lot to do with transforming the identity of being a teacher. And this goes back to the early roots of progressive education in our country, that reflecting about the practice and to do so with other people, and that how writing figures into that practice is really very fundamental to this trying to transform professional identity of being a teacher in this progressive tradition.